Lord Christ. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and besought him, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. There came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, they saw a tumult, and people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. He put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the child got up and walked. She was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. I suspect that for most of us in our culture, the words that have to do with resurrection will always be in a foreign language. Certainly, they are not the language of everyday speech. The word resurrection itself does not occur in our ordinary conversation. It is not in the Sunday morning newspaper. It will not be mentioned on the 11 o'clock news at night. Even William Buckley does not use it on his television program. It's not a part of our normal speech, one with another. Words about resurrection remain in a foreign language. Now, I am not certain, I have no reason to know, why it was that St. Mark so very carefully in the midst of his gospel left the resurrection words in today's gospel in a foreign language. He did, in fact. He left them in Aramaic. The words Talitha cumi are the words as Jesus first spoke them in the spoken language of his land in that time. Mark is at great pains all through his gospel, with one or two exceptions, to translate the words that Jesus spoke to his disciples into the common language of everyday people. That language happened in that time to be Greek, even though the Greek Empire was long gone and people lived under the domination of the Romans. The language of the Roman Empire, the language of philosophy, the language of business, the language of commerce, and the language of the gospel was the Greek language. There may have been some parts of our gospels written down in Aramaic to begin with, but if that was the case, none of those remain, except perhaps for these occasional little snippets of that language which are preserved within the Greek gospel. I don't know why this one was preserved, but I have a suspicion that since the words about resurrection are always in a foreign language, there was some special reason why St. Mark wanted us to hear these words in the language that Jesus used when he spoke them. So he said to the little girl, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, get up, get up. Something always gets lost in translation. There is no good translation, which is a direct word-for-word, literal transliteration of the original text. Some translations are very loosely attached to the original text. I suspect that my junior high school Latin translations into English were very loosely attached to the original, and sometimes they were nothing more than a good guess if the homework had not been done very carefully. But all translation, by definition, is going to be a paraphrase, a setting over into another language of things which cannot be set into another language, things which defy being transferred exactly with exactly the same meanings. The words about God, the words which God uses in his self-disclosure of himself, The way in which God is made known to us loses something in translation. None of our words completely and adequately represent all the meaning that there is in the original. For instance, because Jesus did, we do use the word Father in speaking of God, and yet in translation that word loses something. It loses a great deal if we have by chance had a very bad experience with fatherhood in our own families or with motherhood. It may be a clearer representation of what God is like if we have had a good experience with our own parents, with our own fathers or mothers. But the word itself, which is one of the very definitive words in our language about the very nature of God, is bound to lose something in translation depending upon our experience in the use of that word. Jesus used the word Abba, the Aramaic word for father, when he spoke about God, and thus he conveyed something of the intimacy, of the closeness between himself and the Father in heaven. But that word loses something in translation. I think all the words that we use about God are always going to be less than the reality, and we need to remember in our language that we are not able to describe to each other precisely what our experiences of God are, nor are we able to receive from the past or hand on to the future exact descriptions about the nature of God or the nature of the reality of his relationship to us. We can only approximate, we can only paraphrase God's speech. So Mark leaves these words in the original language as a reminder to us that some words have to be left as they were spoken, since the translation is something which happens for each of us. There is a second thing which the gospel for today says to me. It reminds me, when I hear it, about the way in which my priorities and God's priorities are different. For better or for worse, and I think sometimes for worse, the people who put together the liturgical lectionary have left out the middle of today's gospel. There is something which happened between the beginning and the ending of the story which they have not told us we need to hear. I'm going to remind you of it because it is there. Now, I don't mean to fault them in leaving it out. If you put everything in, the Gospels might become so long that they would wear us out in the hearing. But this particular insertion, which Mark has so very carefully blended into the ongoing story of the raising from the dead of the daughter of Jairus, the president of the synagogue, seems to me to be important. Jairus came to Jesus and asked him if he would come to his house and lay his hand upon his daughter, who was critically ill and about to die. And Jesus said he would, and he began the journey. As they made the journey, a woman who had been troubled for 12 years with a hemorrhage touched the hem of his robe, and he felt the power go out of him, and he stopped the journey and said, "Who touched me?" And she, who had up until this point tried desperately to remain anonymous, had to come forward in honesty and confess that it was she who had touched him and that she had been healed. He felt the power go, and she felt the power move through her body, and her illness was healed. And then he spoke to her about how her faith had made her whole. Now, I don't know about you, but I share the liturgical lectionary writer's impatience with inserting that little story about a passing healing in this major important story about the raising from the dead of a little girl, 12 years old, who died. That's the important thing to me. Jesus is dawdling on the road. Why doesn't he hurry up with this conversation? The woman had been sick for 12 years. She could have managed for another day or two. What difference did it make that he stopped to heal her? Why doesn't he get on with the pressing business which is at hand? That's the way my priorities work. Why doesn't God get on with the pressing business that is on my agenda for him? Why doesn't he hurry up and do whatever it is that I want him to do? My priorities and God's priorities are obviously not alike. And although Jesus was on the business of raising the dead, he was off to the house of Jairus, the president of the synagogue, to raise his daughter. Nevertheless, he stopped. He paused to speak with the woman. who had been healed of a long-term disease. And then the journey continues. The interruption reminds me that his priorities and my priorities are not the same. The girl died. The procession was met next step by some of the family who came to say, "Why do you go on bothering the teacher? The girl is dead. Leave him alone." And Jesus ignored that particular conversation and pressed on to the house of Jairus, and there he performed his miracle of healing. The third thing which this story reminds me of is that we always wait. We always wait until it is too late. It wasn't our Lord's fault that the girl died. If he had been 10 minutes earlier, it would have made no difference. Jairus, the president of the synagogue, had delayed too long in asking for help. He had waited and waited and waited. I don't know why he waited. The reason I think he waited too long is because in my experience, I always wait too long. I always think I can do it by myself. I always think I can put it back together even though it's broken. I always think if I take just one more day, I'll get this business of life all straightened out. It isn't so, of course. I think by definition, we always wait too long. We wait until we are past the point where we can do anything, as Jairus waited too long. It is one of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous and other groups which deal with addiction that a person who is addicted has to come to that point in his or her life where the person knows that there is nothing that he or she can do, that all of the resources have been exhausted. All of the attempts to correct the situation have failed. You have to come to the point where you know you can't do it by yourself. You have to wait until it's too late, and then someone can help you. And that's what happened in this particular story. Jairus waited until it was too late, and then Jesus could help him. It is part of my suspicion that this is characteristic of the way in which life is put together. Religion may be, for some people, a luxury. It may be a hobby. It may be something we do on Sunday mornings. If by chance we have nothing better to do, it may be dessert after the meal. It may be something extra. But I don't think that's true for us. I think for most of us in this room this morning, religion is not a luxury and not a hobby and not something added on to the fullness of life, something to be done because it is done. I think for most of us in this room, religion is desperation. Religion is the only way in which we can find a gleam of meaning in a life which without it would essentially be meaningless. The sacrament is not dessert, but the sacrament is the meal by which our souls are fed, just as the children of Israel in the wilderness found the manna when they had exhausted every other resource, and just as the water came from the rock when their thirst had grown desperate. So we, in our search for God, come to the point of our own desperation and say our prayers and hear Holy Scripture and reach out for the sacrament, because this is food and drink and hope and meaning for desperate, for dying people. The words about resurrection are always in a foreign language. Mark left them that way. Talitha cumi, Jesus said to the little girl, get up, get up. But the words were not left in Aramaic because they were magical, because I can say them over and over and over again to the very end of time, and I will not raise anybody from the dead. You know that, and I know that. The words are not magical words. The words are resurrection words. They are a proclamation. For every one of us in this room is as ill as the little girl was. Every one of us in this room is dying as certainly as she was dying. As Kierkegaard reminded us, we all have a common sickness, and it is sickness to death. We are going to die. So the words Talitha cumi to the Christian community, to those who follow Christ in hope and in faith, are not words simply about a resurrection which took place one day in the life of Jesus in the house of the president of the synagogue. They are about the resurrection which has taken place when Jesus Christ has passed through death and the grave, and made death into life for everyone who follows him in faith and in hope and in love.